Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Phil Fisher webinar. Apologies for the slightly delayed start. Like everyone, we're working from home, so myself and my co-panelist, Anna Gassett, will be running the session today, but we're in different places down the road from each other in each of our houses. So we were just grappling with a few technology issues there. But good morning to everyone, and thank you so much for joining. We just wanted to start by saying we hope that everyone out there on the line and all of their families are doing well in the current times. We know it's a difficult time for everyone, but we hope that everyone is sort of well and doing okay. So for the just to give a quick intro, I am Felicity Fisher, a partner here in the Phil Fisher Silicon Valley office. And I'm joined today by my brilliant co-panelist, Anna, who I just mentioned before. So I'll let Anna say a quick hi.
Hi, I'm Anna Gesso. I am an associate in the Phil Fisher team here in San Francisco, Palo Alto.
Cool. And so we can't promise today is going to be as interesting as the Tiger King on Netflix, which we hope everyone has been watching. And I really wanted to get a reference in there. But what we're hoping to do today is kind of walk you through the rules that apply to those trying to do marketing in Europe. So I'm going to talk you through what those rules are, and then we're going to walk through some kind of common scenarios that people face when, or some common questions that people sort of face when trying to build out a compliant European marketing strategy. And this is really an area where we see lots of questions, lots of confusion about what what you are supposed to do to comply with the rules. So we're hopefully going to kind of demystify the European marketing rules and give you a bit more of a steer. I will say that just to kick things off, there are a few basic things to flag. One is that the rules differ depending on whether you're doing B2B or B2C marketing. And looking at the attendee list on today's webinar, it looks like most people are going to be interested in the B2B marketing rules. So we're going to focus more on those rules and the B2C rules, but I will give you an overview of both. It also will depend on what medium you're using to do your marketing. So whether you're doing postal or telemarketing, where the rules are slightly more relaxed relative to the rules that apply if you're doing any kind of e-marketing, so email, SMS, or if you're doing direct messaging via any kind of social media platform. Those types of marketing mediums would all be regulated in the same way. You also need to think about whether you're doing first or third-party marketing. That is to say, are you doing the marketing yourself, or are you marketing about a third, or collecting consents for a third party to do marketing, because the rules will also differ depending on the type of marketing you're doing there. So we're shortly going to go into more detail, but just before I get into that, I just wanted to flag that very helpfully, and the timing is great on this, our colleagues back in Europe have just published today a summary of the rules that apply in each country, whether you're doing B2B, B2C marketing across Europe. And so there's a really, really helpful table that they've published online, and we can follow up after this webinar with a link to that table, and it kind of helpfully sets out the rules that apply in each of the countries across Europe, and I really direct you to go and have a look at that after this if you have queries about what's the requirements in each specific country. But okay, so I'll kickstart by giving you the general rules, and then Anna is going to go in and give you a little bit more guidance about what you want to think about in terms of strategy for building out your program across Europe. So I think the important thing to remember is that marketing is regulated by two pieces of legislation in Europe, one being the GDPR and the second being something called the e-privacy directive, which we colloquially refer to often as the cookie laws or the marketing laws in Europe. And so when you're thinking about your compliance approach, you really need to think about both the GDPR and the e-privacy directive. So to begin with, marketing under the GDPR, whether it's postal, phone, email, SMS, or any other type of marketing, is regulated exactly like any other data processing activity. And so that means you have to show that you have a lawful basis to conduct the direct marketing. And that it also means that you have to ensure that you've provided transparency to individuals around how you're processing their information for marketing purposes. Now, in many ways, slightly confusingly, the GDPR actually acknowledges that direct marketing can be done on the basis of your legitimate interests as a data controller. Legitimate interest being a non-consent-based ground for data processing. And this often confuses people because people will come and say, well, the GDPR says that we don't necessarily have to get consent because we've looked at recital 47 and it says that processing can be done on the basis of our legitimate interests. But the problem is that, as I just mentioned, marketing regulation under the GDPR is actually only half the story, because Europe has this separate piece of law called the e-privacy directive, and that contains important supplemental rules that you have to think about as well. And basically, if those supplemental rules as set out in the e-privacy directive say that you have to get consent, then it means that you can't rely on your legitimate interest to process personal data, because when you have two pieces of law, so the GDPR and the e-privacy directive, if the e-privacy directive effectively sets a stricter standard, that applies, and you have to disregard the fact that you might be able to rely on your legitimate interest under the GDPR. And if you're looking at the marketing rules under the privacy directive, very broadly speaking, these rules require opt-in consent for email and SMS marketing, and bucketed into that would also be marketing via social media messaging as well. So that's the general rule. At a directive level, you would need opt-in consent for any of your e-marketing. And the only exception to that rule is something that's confusingly as well called the soft opt-in rule. That is to say that if you have collected the individual's contact details in the context of a sale with them, and the individual was given the ability to opt out at the time you collected their information. So there was some kind of box on your data collection form that said, tick here if you do not want to receive marketing from us. And the marketing that you're doing is first-party marketing about similar goods and similar products and services to that which the individual was purchasing, then the law basically says that you don't need to get opt-in consent. You can rely and do your SMS and your email marketing on an opt-out basis. So you can rely on the fact that someone did not tick that box that you provided them at the point of data collection. Similarly, direct marketing via phone or via post can generally be done on an opt-out basis. And in each of those cases, the requirement is basically that you've gone and screened the local do not call me or do not contact me registries to check that the individual has not put themselves on one of those registries and indicated that they do not want to receive telephone marketing or postal marketing. And when you're looking at the telephone marketing requirements, you have to make the distinction between person-to-person live calls, which can be done on the rules that I just set out, i.e. someone hasn't opted out by putting themselves on that do not call me registry, as opposed to automated robotic, calls where there is a stricter opt-in requirement. Now, in fact, the law at a directive level, and when I say directive level, what I mean is that the European marketing rules are set out in something called the e-privacy directive, and a directive is an instrument of law that has to be implemented into each member state's national law. And so that means when I talk about the EU level, I'm talking about what the directive says, But because it is a directive, we always have to then go and look and see how each member state has implemented that directive into its national law. And that means that when you start to look at the national level marketing laws, things can start to get a little bit more funky, because national member states have implemented those marketing laws in quite different, well, broadly consistent, but there are some patchwork differences across Europe in terms of how they've implemented those rules. For example, some countries are much more relaxed and make a much more clearer distinction between B2B and B2C marketing. So whilst the directive doesn't make a distinction between B2B and B2C marketing, at a national level, a lot of countries do. And so whilst the general rule for email marketing might, for example, be opt-in consent, we then can look and see that certain countries have been slightly more relaxed about B2B marketing in their own member state law. For example, the UK is very happy for email marketing on a B2B basis to be done on the basis of opt-out consent. And we can see a few countries across Europe have implemented that requirement in a similar way. I'm just going to stop talking at this point and turn things over to Anna, because she's going to give a little bit more flavour into what certain countries in Europe have done and how to think about that when you're building out your strategy.
Thank you, Flick. So yeah, like you said, I think in general, in each member state, we have the same principle, but the interpretation of the e-privacy directive principle are a bit different. So the first example, and you already went over it, is the B2B direct marketing. So in most countries, you will still need prior opt-in consent, but some won't require that. So UK, France is another good example. I think Ireland is a bit similar as well. So you can just rely on opt-out. The second example is the interpretation of the soft opt-in rule, which is Flick mentioned it, but it's the possibility of sending direct marketing emails or text to existing customers if some criteria are met. One of the criteria is that the contact details must have been collected in the context of a sale. So in some countries, such as France, Belgium, I think Italy as well, you need an actual transaction, while in others, such as the UK, a transaction is not required, and context obtained in the context of a negotiation for sale can be sent direct marketing without prior consent. You just need to make sure that they have actively expressed an interest in buying a product or service, so requesting a quote, for instance. And in some other countries, such as Germany, the soft opt-in rule is very rarely relied upon, because it is really tricky to actually follow. It's really tricky to actually follow the rules and meet all of the criteria, and organizations tend to prefer the double opt-in in Germany. And again, I think as Flick mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, our team in Europe have prepared a table that tells you all the different rules in Europe for direct marketing. And at the right end of that table, you have a column that actually tells you whether you need to have an actual transaction or not to rely on the soft opt-in rule. And I think that's very, very helpful. So if you have Adapt, just check it out, and you'll be able to understand what's your obligation there. Another example of where the rules differ is in the context of telemarketing. So the rules for automated calls, robocalls, are pretty much everywhere the same. You need prior opt-in consent, but the rules for live person-to-person marketing calls are a bit different. Some countries, most countries, will not require prior opt-in consent, but in some, especially in a B2C context, you might need prior opt-in consent. Again, Germany is the first example that comes to mind, but Denmark and Ireland for mobile, I think, are also countries where you need opt-in consent. So I would say that having a global approach is probably the most practical way to go. The rules are not, even in a B2B context, it's much easier in a B2C context because the rules are pretty much exactly the same. You need prior opt-in consent. In a B2B context, the rules are not the same, but I think it's still reasonable to take a risk-based approach and have a global approach for your marketing consent in a B2B context, but you may have to accept a few exceptions where you're going to have to implement a different rules. And I think, again, in Germany, that's where you're probably going to have to agree or to accept that opt-out won't work, even in a B2B context. People really care about their choices and the right to privacy there. So be careful. Double opt-in should be the rule. Cold calling is also very high risk in Germany. Another country to watch out for is Austria, which is a bit similar, a bit like Germany. You need double opt-in consent. So for those who don't know what double opt-in is you need to get prior opt-in consent at the time of collection of the personal details, contact details, but you need to confirm that consent via an email. So it might be a bit more complicated in these countries, but I think other than that, for other European countries, it's a risk-based approach to get to take a uniform approach. But again, I think the risk of enforcement are really low in these countries. In fact, we don't really see a lot of enforcement in a B2B context in Europe. We have a few decisions in the last 5 years, but not as many as in a B2C context. And we see a lot of our clients will actually take that uniform approach, which is, well, it's B2B, so we might, except for Germany and Australia, for the other country, we might just decide to go on an opt-out to the extent that you're really transparent. I think transparent and choice are really key there. So you need to make sure that you give your prospect and customer to opt out at any time. So in all the emails that you send, you make sure you always have an unsubscribe link, and you're transparent in your privacy policy at the time of collection. I think if you follow those rules, they should be very low risk.
Yeah, so just to summarize that, you know, we're basically saying that anything less than opt-in consent, even in a B2B context, does run some risk for your in terms of your email marketing campaigns. But because many countries in Europe allow B2B email marketing on an opt-out basis, including, for example, the UK, then if you're willing to take a risk-based approach to your email marketing, then you could move forward on an opt-out basis, but you may, if you want to try and mitigate some of that risk, choose to exclude certain countries like Germany or Austria, where there is a stricter double opt-in requirement, so your risk in taking that opt-out approach is elevated. So I think the next question that we always get is, well, what happens in the context of information that we've obtained from third parties or that we've potentially scraped from publicly available sources? Are we allowed to use that data to do our marketing activities? And I think this is a tricky area. So it's not necessarily the case that the law will absolutely prevent you from using third-party data for your marketing purposes, but you can't just use it without regard for the law. There are certain things that you're going to need to think about. So, for example, the fact that personal data may have been publicly available, for example, on social media sites, won't take it outside the scope of the GDPR. And neither will the fact that you got it from a third-party data provider who claims that all of the information is properly GDPR consented to. And those are two very different scenarios. And I'll start with the publicly scraping information scenario. So I think generally scraping personal data always carries some privacy risk in Europe because it is quite difficult to do it in compliance with the European privacy and marketing laws, principally because it's quite challenging to comply with the GDPR transparency obligations, or to obtain those consents that you might need to obtain for marketing purposes. And as we just discussed, the risk is invariably sort of greater in places like Germany, where the requirements can be stricter for undertaking marketing in those countries. So I think there's a few things you need to think about. First is, if you've scraped it from a publicly available source, you may need to check that you've got the actual permission from the underlying source. So what does that website's terms and conditions say? And that's not necessarily strictly a privacy matter, but potentially falls more into the IP realm that you need to think about. Now, when you've scraped contact details, those contact details will be personal data. And so to be able to use that, you need to make sure that you're, one, you have a lawful basis under the GDPR to process that data. And secondly, you need to make sure that you've given people transparency about how you're going to use their information. And the law has basically tried to catch this scenario because there is a specific provision in the GDPR under Article 14, which applies if you've collected data from a third party, or in this case, not collected it directly from the individual. And Article 14 basically says, in that case, if you didn't collect the information directly, you still need to make sure that you've gone and given people basically a copy of your privacy policy or the transparency information set out in Article 14. And the law says that you've got to do that within a reasonable period and latest within a month of having received that data. And if you intend to use the data to go and market to them, or if you're intending to share it with another party, then you're supposed to have given that notice basically at the time you're doing that, if that's before your month period is up. And what does that notice need to say? Well, it needs to include things like the source of the data. So you need to be telling people where you obtain that information. And if you look at the regulatory guidance, they want you to specifically name the third-party source. And you've also got to provide information about the categories of information you're processing, and there's a long list of information in Article 14 that you would need to be providing to those individuals. So when you've got data that you've scraped or that you've obtained from a third party, one of the things you've got to think about is, how do we get that notice out to the underlying individuals? Because if you haven't provided them with notice, then you're not going to be able to defend your legal basis or find a legal basis to be able to be processing that information. Now, there are some exceptions to this requirement to give notice that people kind of hope to hang on to. One of those exceptions is that the information has already been provided to that individual. And so this might be relevant if, for example, you've gone and obtained the information from a third-party data broker or someone who's licensed the data to you. They may often say, well, we've provided them with the information to satisfy the transparency obligation. So they don't often say that, but if you hear them say that, then the first thing you need to go and do is check, well, hang on a second, what notice has actually been provided to these individuals? What does the third party's own privacy policy say? Does it specifically name us so that individuals will know to come and look at our privacy policy? In most cases, we suspect not. Sorry, if you can hear the tap going in the background, it's my husband making tea. Tough times working from home. Yeah, so in most cases, if you've received it from a third party, they probably won't have given that proper notice. And so you probably need to be doing something like sending the individual an email to say, hey, we've received your information, or we have a copy of your information. Here's a link to our privacy policy, or coming up with something a little bit more friendly than that. But essentially, you need to, within a month of having received the data, got them out a notice which explains what you're doing with their data, unless they've already been provided the information, which is unlikely. Or there's a second exemption you might be able to rely on, which is that it would involve a disproportionate effort to go and reach out to all of those individuals whose information you've processed. Now, everybody thinks, brilliant, we're just going to rely on this disproportionate effort exemption because we've just licensed in thousands of contacts. It would take us a huge amount of resource and money to now go and find a way to get a notice out to them. So great stuff, we'll just rely on this disproportionate effort exemption, and we'll just post a privacy policy in our website and be done with it. But unfortunately, that exception to the notice requirement is very narrowly construed. And in fact, we've had some rather unhelpful case law in this area coming out of Poland in the relatively well-publicized case of Bisnode. And basically, Biznode was a verification service, and they had gone and scraped a whole load of information. This was core to their business model. They're essentially a registry for certain data sets so that people could come and license or access. And so they'd scraped a whole load of information about professionals, so sole traders and shareholders in businesses, to put on this registry. I think they had 7.5 million records, and they sort of said, well, we've told 700,000 people from that list about the fact we've got their information, so they shot those guys an email because they had their email address. But they decided for the other contacts, because they didn't have an email address, it would involve a disproportionate effort to go and post all of those individuals an email address. And in fact, they produced evidence that having to send those postal notices would cost them more than the revenue that they would make over a certain period. So again, it all looked good for them. It would involve a disproportionate effort. But unfortunately, the court said absolutely not. You had their postal address, and so you should have gone and sent them a postal notice. And you can't rely on this disproportionate effort exemption. So, and there were some nuances to that case, which I'd be happy to walk through if anyone has any questions. But essentially, it is going to be very narrowly construed. If you have contact information for those individuals, whether it be postal or email, you should be finding a way to get them notice. And if you can't find, if you really don't have a good way to provide them notice, then you should make sure that you've at the very least published a privacy policy on your website and you've done some sort of privacy impact assessment to show why you can't provide notice and how that you've thought about the other principles that might apply. The other thing you've got to think about is when you're getting data from a third party, remember that there is that general requirement to have got opt-in consent to do marketing to individuals via email. And, you know, a third-party data broker might say to you, well, don't worry, we've got a consented bunch of data for you. So all the information in there is great and you're good to go and use it. I think that needs to be regarded with, well, at least evaluated and scrutinized with a bit more care, and we definitely recommend that you go and do more due diligence on that third party, because valid consent for marketing in this context would mean that they would have had to have told the individual about the fact not only that the information would be shared with you, but they would have had to provide their specific opt-in consent for you to go and do the marketing. And that would mean that you would have had to be specifically named next to that tick box instead of that third party just generally having a box that says that they might go and share the information with, you know, selected third parties. So in most cases, they won't have gone and got that specific consent. And so you'll be relying on, you know, you will have a whole bunch of data which probably there is no valid consent to do marketing, and so you end up having to take a risk-based approach, which generally looks something like, we're going to send those people an email within a month of having received their data. We're going to tell them about the fact we're going to market to them. We're going to give them a link to our privacy policy, and we're going to tell them that if they don't want to receive marketing from us, they can very easily do that by unsubscribing here or going to your marketing preference center. But you should all be aware that that approach of you know, essentially relying on an opt-out based approach to do marketing in reliance on third-party data will always run some compliance risk in Europe, and particularly in places like Germany where there is that strict double opt-in requirement. Sorry, I've been talking for a while, so I'll move over to Anna.
No, it's fine. I think you're right, Flick. It's good to have contractual terms that require the data broker or lead generation provider to make sure that they get consent or sufficient transparency, but that's not enough. Ultimately, you are responsible to make sure that the data was legally sourced or lawfully sourced, and that consent, if consent is needed, was actually collected. And that was actually reminded by the recent Belgian guidance. So something to keep in mind. But moving on to the in-app push notification and social platform messaging. So we get we tend to get a lot of question about that recently. I think the question that we get a lot is we want the sales team wants to be able to send email via LinkedIn or via another social platform. Should we regard it as an electronic direct marketing? So should it be regulated like emails or text? And there is no clear response, but our approach is to think, and that's also the approach that has been taken by many regulators, is to regard them as electronic direct marketing. So you should comply with the e-privacy rules. So if you need prior opt-in consent, then you will need to get prior opt-in consent for those social platform direct messaging. If it's in a B2B context, like we said, the main rule is prior opt-in, but in some countries you can rely on opt-out. So same thing for social platform messaging. Same question about in-app or push notification. So most countries, such as Germany, UK, will regard them as electronic direct marketing. So you have to be careful with those in-app messaging. You might not be realizing that these are direct marketing, but to the extent that you're trying to upsell or you're trying to promote your product, these will be regarding as direct marketing, and you will need to comply with the e-privacy rules. And I think the other thing to keep in mind in that in many in-app messaging and push notification, you will also need to use cookies. So you will also need to make sure you comply with the cookies rules and get prior opt-in consent for these. I think you have to think about all the in-app messages that you use for your product. In most cases, you might use them for onboarding, and you might not even realize that they are direct marketing. But again, these will be regarding as direct marketing. But the risks are probably lower, especially in a B2B context, especially if they are existing customer, because even where you will need opt-in consent, if they're existing customer, you might rely on the soft opt-in rule. And I think the risk will be even lower if we are in a context, for instance, of someone from your sales team reaching out to a prospect that they know on LinkedIn, and they send them a personalized message. I think in those circumstances and those contexts, the risk would be quite low. But I think, again, you just have to realize and keep in mind that these are, they will be regulated like emails or text messages are regulated. So you can't just disregard those rules because you're not using emails and you're using in-app messaging or a social media platform.
Yeah. And I think it's also really important that context is king here with some of this stuff. So we've talked a lot about a risk-based approach, and I think you've always got to put your self in the eyes of the recipient of the data. So, you know, if you've had, if they're a warm contact or somebody where there is context, they came to your booth at an event, or they've, you know, been looking at your content online, they've asked, you know, to see information about your product, etc., then, you know, it's going to be a lot easier to take the risk-based approach. You should also, you know, related to that, there's also matters around sort of keeping good data hygiene to kind of reduce your compliance risk. So making sure that you're keeping, you know, the contacts that you've got are up to date and accurate, that you're not trying to market to really old contacts who you've not spoken to in a long time. You know, it's been 2 years or a year since you spoke to them, or you know, you've I'm just trying to think if you've kind of bought in a load of information, didn't go and send them any information about what you're doing, didn't go and send that email to them telling them you've got their information, and now you're just hitting them up with loads of marketing, all that stuff is more likely to get you in trouble, because people will just not want to receive it and get frustrated, and then they're more likely to complain. So just making sure that your marketing is relevant, you're thinking about, you're making sure you're screening the contacts that you get against your internal opt-out or suppression lists, so that you're not not ever sending marketing to people who have already opted out. You're not trying to use really out of date contact information. All of that could, you know, lead to people just getting upset, and that's what will get you in trouble.
And I think the frequency is key here as well. So I know in the US, it's quite common practice to send direct marketing emails every day or twice a week. It's not the case in Europe. So just remember that there are some cultural differences, and you might want to limit the frequency of your marketing communications.
Yeah, and I just mentioned in that, what I was saying, the scenario of someone coming to your booth at an event. And it's quite a common question we get around, you know, we're scanning people's badges at an event, and now we want to follow up and do marketing to them. Is that okay? And I think there are a few things to think about. One is what information has been provided to those individuals to set the expectation that you're going to follow up and do marketing to them. And that may involve checking, well, what notice was provided to the individuals when they signed up for the event? So has the event organizer already set that expectation in the privacy policy that was provided to them when they signed up for the event? And then what consents did the event organizer obtain when people signed up for the event? So was it specific enough to cover you because you were listed as an event sponsor at the time they signed up? Or do you need to think about, well, you know, we need to go and get our own marketing consents because the event organizer hasn't done it for us. And so we need to set an expectation that when someone comes to our booth and we scan their badge, one, we're telling them that that means, you know, the act of scanning the badge is something we're treating as consent to market. And the way that you can set that expectation is you might need to have a kind of notice on your stand or your booth that says and tells people very clearly that when you visit our booth, you know, and we scan your badge, that we're going to use your contact details to market to you. If you don't want us to do that, don't let us scan your badge. And here's a link to the, you know, our privacy policy. And if you want to be even more robust, you might even follow up with those individuals and say, hey, thanks for visiting our booth. Here's a link to our privacy policy. Here's information about how you can opt out from receiving marketing for us. So those are the types of things you can do to make sure that you kind of are able to reach out to those individuals in a more compliant way. One really important takeaway is never try and email somebody to ask for their consent to marketing, because the very act of sending that email, maybe it will itself be a marketing email that you don't necessarily have permission for. So it's never a good idea to go out and say, do you consent to receiving marketing from us, and ask people to do it via an email. That doesn't work. So if, for example, you were somebody or a company that decided in the run-up to the GDPR, for example, that you would go and then switch everyone to opt-in consent. So you sent out those emails that said, you know, basically asking people to re-consent to marketing. One, it's, you know, that was probably a questionable approach, but that's a whole other separate analysis. But two, I imagine that what happened is that nobody or a large number of people just didn't consent, because guess what? People won't go and consent if you ask them to do it in an email like that. Most people will ignore it. And so one of the questions we got was, well, we went out and asked for consent. Nobody consented. Can we now go back to them and, you know, ask for forgiveness and see if we can still continue to go market to them? And it's really difficult to go back and correct that approach. If you've gone out and asked for consent, people didn't give you consent, and it's really, really difficult to retroactively go back and try and market to them. You run a really high risk in taking that approach. So, you know, I think it's always, you know, don't send out those emails asking for consent without having checked with your compliance team around whether or not that's the best approach to take, because you could have a massive drop-off rate and ruin your chances of going back and sort of you know, getting in touch with those individuals. And we might, you know, there are some workarounds, but it will always be a risk-based approach. So it's never a good idea to take the do you consent via email approach.
So I think we have a few minutes to discuss service message, renewal message, and survey, because we also get a few questions on those. So just to be clear, service messages, if they are really service message, service email, these are not treated as direct marketing, and they do not require prior opt-in consent or opt-out. But in reality, a lot of what you would regard as service message might be actually regarded as direct marketing communication. I think an example would be a renewal email. So if you're sending a renewal email to your customers to let them know that their subscription is soon expiring and asking them to renew, these will be a service message unless there is some marketing content or some marketing materials in that communication. An example would be if you're just sending an email saying, "Hey, your subscription is soon is expiring. Please renew." Then I think that will probably be regarded as a service email. But if you tell them, "Well, your subscription is soon expiring. If you renew now, you can get 20% off," then that could be regarded as direct marketing and will require prior opt-in or opt-out. And the same thing for survey. If you're sending a survey or customer satisfaction email, I think these are in most European countries regarded as service message. Not the case in Germany though. So they will be regarding as direct marketing in Germany, but in general they are service message. But if there are any marketing material in that email, if you're trying to sell or promote your company, your organization, then be careful because those will be regulated as direct marketing communication.
Cool, and I think that's pretty much us at time. And so, if you guys have any follow-up questions, please do reach out to us. We'd be very happy to answer them. As I said, we've got that online publication that we just mentioned earlier. We'll follow up and send you a link to that, which gives you a really good summary of the requirements in each of the different countries. Also, just a quick shout out, if you really liked this webinar, we have others on our YouTube channel and we regularly post webinars. We try to do it every few weeks. So keep a lookout for future webinars that we're doing. We also have, and we're very proud of it, a Phil Fisher Silicon Valley podcast. And so you can find that on all the usual places. And I think our next one of the podcast is going to be on security standards. So the ISO 27001 might not be the sexiest of topics, but some people might be interested in that. We're also going to be doing a session on how to use your DPO effectively. So keep a lookout for some of that content that will be coming out soon. But thanks very much for joining us today. Keep healthy and well, and reach out to Anna or I if you have any questions. We'd be very happy to answer them.
Thank you.
Bye.